the agenda.
I know you do. Okay.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Blair Rubel, and I'm Director of Comparative Urban Studies here at the Wilson Center. And this is really a wonderful event for us. But before I get to all the reasons why it's wonderful and turn it over to the speakers, I have a couple of administrative announcements. The first and most important is that this building, at least our facilities, have an annoying habit of picking up signals from all sorts of personal gadgets. So if you can please turn off cell phones, pagers. It's not just that somebody will dart up in the middle of the meeting and run out. It's that actually some messages can be broadcast to other people in the room, and you may not want that. So I want to ask that people take special care and turn off all mobile communication devices. We have our own open mic policy here at the Wilson Center. What can I say? I also want to thank my colleagues with the Comparative Urban Studies Project, Lauren Hertzer, Allison Garland, and Sarah Newman. You may have seen them when you were coming in. They pulled together this meeting. There are a lot of materials that are available out there. I want to particularly mention one that's available for free and is a little bit unusual because it's on the city of Odessa and the city of New Orleans, and there's a special place in history. And for those of you who are interested in cities, you may find this of interest. And if, as I said, just pick one up on the way out. Finally, we are officially scheduled till 3:30, and if the discussion is lively and even heated and there's a desire to go to 3:30, we will. But I also, as chair, will recognize that it's a Friday in July, and we don't necessarily have to go to 3:30 if people start thinking weekend thoughts ahead of time. But I don't think that you will, because this is really a wonderful opportunity for us and for you. Derek Hyra's new book is out, and if you came in early, they're now for sale outside. This is like, jazz musicians who pull the CDs out from under the table and won't let you leave the club until you buy one. This isn't quite that bad, but as with jazz musicians in a club, I think Derek will sign a CD or two, or a CD, right, a book or two, and the CD is coming. I got to know Derek because he came to a meeting here, and the one thing I learned a while ago running programs like this is to make special note of somebody who seems keenly intelligent and pleasant and thoughtful. And I started talking to Derek, and those initial impressions were all wrong. He's actually more than that. He's really quite special, and I think when you read the book you'll see that. And I think all of us who are concerned with urban issues in Washington are lucky that he is here and not at some of the other places he spent in his career, which include, of course, the University of Chicago and Harvard University, the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute, and he taught at Brown and Illinois Institute of Technology as well as at the University of Chicago. He's here as a community development expert at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. My suspicion is that on a day like today, when you take a look at the headlines, that there are issues which may be dealing with communities and housing and finance that perhaps the Department of Treasury is paying attention to. So we're very fortunate that he is with us today. I've had a chance to look at the book. It literally is hot off the presses, and as I think you'll get a flavor of from the comments today, it really is worth spending some time with. I'm going to go ahead and briefly introduce the other speakers. The bios were made available in written form, so I'm just going to quickly say a few words about the other speakers, and then we'll just go with the flow. On my far left, Mary Pattillo is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Department of African American Studies, as well as a faculty affiliate at the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern. She's, as you'll see from her bio, she has many, many accomplishments. I just mentioned her recent book, Black on the Block, The Politics of Race and Class in the City. And when I was talking with Derek about whom we should invite to comment, she was one of the people he really wanted. So I'm glad that you got on an airplane and came here. Marjorie Turner is at the Urban Institute, so she didn't have to get on a plane or train to get here, but she's one of the people in the urban studies community who is enriched by having Derek in town. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research at HUD during the Clinton administration, and before that she was Director of the Housing Research Program at the Urban Institute, and you'll see from the bios that she too has a very illustrious career, which really makes it appropriate for her to comment on this particular study. And then we'll hear from the Honorable Keith L.T. Wright, who's been in the New York State Assembly since 1992, and he's been Assistant Majority Whip since 1998. He chairs the Social Services Committee. He graduated from Rutgers Law School, from Tufts, the Fieldston School, and the Ethical Culture School. Prior to becoming an assemblyman, he served in the city's Human Resources Administration, the borough's president office, and the New York City Transit Authority, probably at a time when I was a member of a group called the Subway Riders Coalition Strap Hangers Campaign.
Sure, Gene Russell, yeah.
So we were probably on opposite sides of some of those issues. So.
Probably on the same side.
Yeah, but,
I was a spy.
You're a spy. Yeah, this is a Subway Riders group run by a really wonderful man, Gene Russinoff, up in New York. So with that, I'm just going to turn the floor over to Derek, and it's all yours. You can stand, sit, whatever you're most comfortable.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming today. This is truly a remarkable day for me. This is the culmination of over 10 years worth of work, and I'm so pleased that all of you could be here to share this with me. I want to thank the Wilson Center for putting this together and coordinating it. Blair, Lauren, and Allison have done just a tremendous job of getting out the invites and getting this day together. I also want to thank the funders for this research. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development all supplied resources that enabled this project to take place. Also, I got to thank the University of Chicago Press. Their marketing team and editing team just did a tremendous job on this book and really polished it up and got it to the form that it is today, and I thank them. You often shouldn't thank your panelists until after they present because you don't exactly know what they're going to say, but I think, and I could be pretty confident in thanking them prior to their comments, but I thank them all for being here today. And I especially want to thank my wife, Allison, and also my son, Avery, who is there bouncing in the back. Avery didn't do that much work on it. He's only been here for 5 months, but Allison just was a tremendous support through this entire process, and a lot of the form that the book's in is owed to her. So thank you. I also want to thank my family. My mom and dad and sister came out. I have a lot of friends here and former colleagues from HUD here as well, and I'm kind of surprised that they're actually here because for the last 2 years, I've been talking about this book constantly to all of them. So to hear me speak about it once again sort of shocks me that they wanted to actually torture themselves and come back and hear some more. But thanks all for being here. And I just want to say before I get started that the views that I express today are not the views of the Treasury Department or the U.S. government. I'm speaking on behalf of my own accord here, so the views that I present are my own. So what I want to do today is I just want to sort of give you a broad stroke kind of overview of the book and really just throw out a couple of remarks and comments that will hopefully engage you and engage the speakers who will comment as well. And so I'll probably speak for about 20 minutes and then turn it over to the panelists. But In the 1980s and 1990s, urban sociologists, urban planners, and policymakers were concerned with one major issue. And that issue was how to break up the concentration of poverty in the inner city. Between 1970 and 1990, the number of communities that had over 40% of residents living below poverty status doubled. These areas were extremely problematic because they were associated with elevated rates of teen pregnancy, crime, school dropout, and so on and so forth. And so it was a real concern to try to sort of break up these high poverty areas. William Julius Wilson and Doug Massey, two sociologists, were pretty much the two key figures in this debate. Wilson advocated for policies that brought jobs to the inner city, while Massey really looked at sort of breaking up the concentration of black neighborhoods and really trying to promote racial integration to try to break up these concentrated poverty areas. Well, when these scholars put out their classic works in 1993 and 1996, I don't think anyone really foresaw what was about to occur and what was occurring while these books were published. In the mid and late 1990s, we had a second round of urban renewal. Inner city areas located in certain cities, in particular that were located in areas in close proximity to the downtown central business districts, after decades of decline, experienced a wave of redevelopment. This happened in Boston, it happened in New York, it happened in Chicago, it happened in Charlotte, it happened in Atlanta, it happened in LA, it happened in Minneapolis. So low-income areas in these cities started to really revitalize. I mean, here we can see it in D.C. For those of you who've been up to the U Street corridor, you see the redevelopment taking place in Shaw. We also see it in Anacostia. So this is a phenomenon that's not just occurring in New York and Chicago. This is happening all around the country. With this development, between 1990 and 2000, we actually saw a decrease in the number of high poverty areas. It declined by 26%. We also saw an increase in poverty moving from the inner city and moving on to the inner suburbs. The changing landscape throughout the last century in the inner city has told us quite a bit about the dynamics influencing urban American life. The creation of the black ghettos with the Great Migration in the early part of the 20th century signaled industrialization and northern segregation. The decline of these areas in the 1960s and 1970s expressed deindustrialization having an impact, suburbanization, and also continued white racism in America. And so this book, The New Urban Renewal, really looks at the dynamics that are related to the urban transformation that's happening in the 21st century. In the book, I examine the social, economic, and political forces that are leading to the redevelopment of two of the most historic black communities in the country, Harlem in New York City and Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago. When I talk about Harlem, I'm really referring to central Harlem, so I just want to make that clear. And really, that's from 110th Street up to 155th Street, from Fifth Avenue over to Morningside and St. Nicholas Park. Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago is the Douglas and the Grand Boulevard area. It goes from 22nd Street down to 51st Street, from the Dan Ryan over to Cottage Grove. So I just wanted to, for those of you who are familiar with those cities, you kind of get a sense of exactly the space what I'm talking about. When I throw out statistics, the statistics that I'm referring to are based on those localities. So these areas symbolize the redevelopment trend that is taking place in cities all across the U.S. Harlem and Bronzeville for the last 50 years were some of the most impoverished black communities in the country. They suffered from disinvestment, extreme concentrations of poverty, high levels of unemployment, and crime. However, today, these two areas are experiencing a second renaissance. Harlem and Bronzeville, once redlined by banks, are now being greenlined, with billions of dollars coming in from the public and the private sector to these communities. Luxury condos are going up, spas, bed and breakfasts, they're popping up all over these communities. And between 1990 and 2000, the median family income doubled in these areas, and property values just skyrocketed. To get a brownstone in Harlem, now you have to pay between $1 million and $2 million for one. You may even pay more these days. The gray stones in Bronzeville, they're going for $600,000 and up. So it's tremendous what has sort of happened in terms of property values in these communities. These communities really have gone from the crack house really to the coffee house, and the coffee houses are popping up all over. Starbucks being one of them. There's a Starbucks in Harlem. There's a Starbucks in Bronzeville. But what's interesting about the redevelopment that's taking place is that this is not following the typical story of gentrification. The redevelopment in these two communities is unique because this transformation that is occurring with very little white influx. In Harlem, the white population from 1990 to 2000 went from 1.1%, basically went from 1% to 1.5%. While the development was occurring. In Bronzeville, the figure went from 2% to 4%. Today, Harlem is around 80% African American, Bronzeville 90% plus. So the population that's moving into these neighborhoods are black professionals, black lawyers, bankers, and doctors. So what can the new urban renewal tell us about contemporary urban society? For instance, the questions I ask: what are the forces related to this redevelopment? And how is this affecting the inner city residents that live in these communities? And what does the process of black gentrification tell us about the state of black civil society, but also what does it tell us about the state of white-black relations? And these are some of the questions that I explore in the manuscript. So let me tell you some of the reasons why you might want to go out afterwards and buy the book. This book, because there has been so many studies done on Harlem and Bronzeville, and I'm not talking about the studies that were done in 1940, 1950, and so on. I'm talking about the studies that have gone from 2000 onward forward, looking at this redevelopment process. And I want to sort of distinguish what I've written compared to the other studies that have gone on. First, this is the first study that has a comparative approach. I basically lived in Bronzeville from 1999 to 2001 and did my sort of ethnography there, but then moved to Harlem for a 6-month period in 2002, then came back to Bronzeville, and then went back to Harlem for another 6-month period. So this is really the first study that's going to look comparatively at the urban redevelopment process. It is also one of the first studies that takes a multi-level analysis approach. Each of my chapters really focus on a different level. The book sort of begins with looking at the macro economy, looking at the international economy, looking at economic globalization, and trying to figure out how is economic globalization related to the changes that are taking place in these communities. From there, I move on to the national scene, national politics, national policies that were implemented in the 1990s. But from there, I look at the cities, and then I also move to these communities. And 2 of the chapters focus specifically on what are community residents doing to promote the development, and how are they sort of reacting to the development forces that are happening in their community. So this book is really a real comprehensive sort of analysis of the primary variables that are influencing these communities. Most studies sort of look at one level of analysis or another, or they just look at one community, and so you're really getting, I think, a deeper understanding with this book because of the comprehensive approach. Also, this study is an ethnography. I lived in both of these communities, so the evidence that I present is, I do present some statistics from the census, but really the primary evidence is the testimony and behaviors of residents in the community. And so I think that gives a lot of flavor to this analysis. I spoke with people in bars, in their house, on the street, in recreation centers, in the laundromat. And so the testimony that I'm getting from people, not just through interviews, although I did do that and sit down with community leaders, but also just from walking around and living in the community. And that really what gives you the tacit knowledge of understanding about the processes that are impacting these communities. I also spoke with a very diverse set of residents. These areas, they may be looked at as homogeneous because they're majority black, but they're very diverse. They're diverse economically, and they're diverse in many ways. So I spoke with homeowners. I spoke with newcomers to the community. I spoke with residents that had lived there their whole lives, like Assemblyman Wright. I talked with public housing tenants. I talked with others who had key community stakeholders, such as real estate developers and political leaders and staff of city agencies. And all of these people sort of saw the development in a different way. And I tried to bring together all of their perspectives to understand comprehensively what was taking place. Lastly, I had incredible access to key community leaders in these communities. In Harlem, State Assemblyman Keith Wright, he took me everywhere to the community. I mean, when a developer was coming in and wanted to do a condo, I was in the meeting. When the activists who were upset about pressures of displacement, I was there hearing them. I mean, Keith really opened up the entire community of Harlem to me. I mean, basically, when I went into a meeting, no one questioned who I was because they knew that I worked for Keith. In Bronzeville, I had Dr. Sakoni Karanja, who heads the Center for New Horizons in Bronzeville, and also members of the Southside Partnership were really instrumental in bridging relationships in the community. And really, having these relationships allowed for me to do a very in-depth analysis of political culture and political action. And as I'll go on, really some of the keys to understanding what's happening in these neighborhoods is to understand the difference in politics in Harlem versus the politics in Bronzeville. But I'll just tell you one quick story about having access to key community leaders. The second day I worked for Assemblyman Wright, he said, hey, Derek, I want to take you down to a fundraiser on Tavern on the Green. And I think I don't know what I had on, but I wasn't very dressed up that day. I didn't have on shorts, but I think I had on jeans. He said, don't worry about it. We're going to go down to Tavern on the Green. I want you to meet some folks. Well, going down with Assemblyman Wright, I met Charles Rangel that day. I met Governor David Patterson that day. I met the former New York State Comptroller Carl McCall that day. I met the former Governor of New York State, Eliot Spitzer. And when I was talking with Charles Rangel, he says to me, he said, hey, Derek, come here. He says, and he leans over and he says, look, I want to tell you this. And he did it in this raspy voice, you know how he talks. And he said, any friend of Keith is a friend of mine. And I'm telling you, with him saying that, I tried to get an interview with Charles Rangel multiple times. And with that introduction, also, I met David Dinkins as well. Both Keith and David Dinkins sort of got me the interview literally the next day with Charles Rangel. So he really opened up the political scene in Harlem for me. So, Keith, thank you for that. All right. I've structured, let me sort of get into some of my findings now. How are we doing on time? 10 minutes? Okay, we're good. What I did is I structured my findings in this way. I want to compare, I called it the new urban renewal. So let's take a look at urban renewal of the 1950s and 60s, and let's sort of compare the dynamics that are affecting inner city communities then to now. And so I want to sort of point out some of the similarities and differences between the old urban renewal and what I'm coining the new urban renewal. So one of the key things that's similar is in both time periods, federal policy was so critical in terms of the redevelopment that took place. The Federal Housing Act of 1949 and of 1953 basically deployed billions of dollars to cities around the country to build public housing, to do demolition of decaying infrastructure, to help build universities and high-rises and do all these things. And so when we talk about urban renewal, we really need to do an assessment of the national federal policy. Today, the Hope 6 program has allocated, starting in 1990, well, it was enacted in 93, but started in 1994, started to deploy billions of dollars. And until this date, I think it's between $6 and $7 billion has been deployed to knock down public housing and to do mixed income redevelopment in inner city areas. So that's definitely a factor that's related to the renewal that we're seeing taking place. Also, the Empowerment Zone, another initiative, $100 million deployed to certain cities around the country, has had a major impact in this development trend. But now let's sort of tease out some of the important differences. One of the differences is, and I argue this in the book, economic globalization is critical to understanding the redevelopment process that is taking place today. Downtown centralization, the expansion of the central business district, is related to why adjacent and nearby inner city communities are redeveloping. what you're seeing is that this redevelopment pattern isn't happening everywhere. It's not happening in Detroit. It's not happening in Kansas City. It's not happening in St. Louis. It's not happening in the cities that are not connected to the global economy. The cities that are seeing an influx of high-wage workers that are related to sort of the high-wage service sector industry. They're putting market pressures on the downtowns, and the downtowns are expanding. And when they expand, there's market pressures that are placed on places like Harlem and Bronzeville. I would make the argument that we really weren't seeing the global economy playing a factor in the 1950s and the 1960s. The other key point I want to make with the redevelopment, I think most scholars would agree that the urban renewal that happened in the 50s and 60s had an adverse effect on black urban America. It ripped apart communities. It basically built up high-rise public housing. It's related to the concentration of poverty that we just talked about earlier. And so there really weren't any beneficial effects besides maybe a few black politicians got elected, which that is definitely something that a lot of political scientists will bring up as one of the benefits of urban renewal and sort of the segregation that occurred during this time. But as a whole, most members of urban black America did not benefit from the redevelopment. The money that went in for urban renewal during that period, it went to white real estate developers, white construction companies, and they were the ones that were profiting from this development. That is not the case today. Today, the urban renewal is associated with benefits for a certain class, a certain segment of black America. A lot of African Americans are making money off the real development that's happening today. There are black real estate developers in Bronzeville and in Harlem who are making millions of dollars off constructing the high-rise condominiums, and they're playing a role either developing these buildings or managing the buildings that are being built today. So we really sort of need to take a look at that. Also, homeowners in these communities are building up equity. Now, all of that equity might have been wiped out with the credit crisis and the devalue of property. I mean, as of July of 2007, we've seen a decrease in home value. But if we look at some people who basically sold their homes up until 2007, they cashed in. And so there was some equity that was built up in the residents that were homeowners in these communities. So the intersection of race and class is really crucial to understand who's benefiting and who's losing. And I'll talk about who's losing in a moment. But the results of and the dynamics in terms of the gentrification and the redevelopment that's happening today is definitely, you're seeing an intersection of race and class, and it's not the same in terms of consequences for black America that we saw in the 1950s and 60s. Last point I want to make, and I talked about this a little bit, was the city political structures are key to understanding the outcomes of redevelopment in Harlem and Bronzeville. Now, New York City and Chicago's political structure are totally different. Chicago is a Democratic one-party town. If you want to get something done in Chicago, you have to go through Mayor Daley. He controls the resources. In New York City, that's not the case. You have Democrats and Republicans who have served in the mayor's position. But not only that, even if a Democrat is in power, there are multiple actors who control resources in New York City. So community-based organizations, when they need to get resources, they can go to multiple people in New York City. In Chicago, it's one. That structure has consequences for the rates of civic engagement and protest politics related to the redevelopment. It also has major consequences for the type and also the level of displacement that's occurring during this redevelopment. So I'm going to sort of sketch out and give you one quick example, because I think I'm running out of time a bit. I know I'm the author, and I think I have some prerogative to talk a little bit longer maybe, but I just want to sketch out one example of this. So in 1998, Congress passed the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act. What that did is that took out the one-for-one, permanently repealed the one-for-one replacement of public housing. So in the past, if you knock down a public housing unit, if the city decided to do that, they'd have to build another one. So right after that passed, the city of Chicago came up with their plan to demolish basically all of the distressed public housing high-rises in Chicago. So in Bronzeville, the redevelopment is associated with the displacement of over 17,000 people who lived in public housing or being displaced from Bronzeville. This is not happening in Harlem. In Harlem, the public housing isn't going down. It isn't going anywhere. There are approximately 20,000 people that live in public housing in central Harlem, and they are going to be able to have the opportunity to benefit from the redevelopment that's taking place. So this outcome, I argue in the book, is related to the history of public housing and politics in each of these cities. In the city of Chicago since 1955, and that's when Mayor Daley Sr. Began his reign, public housing was not really used primarily to build quality housing. It was used as a political patronage tool. And that has been the history of Chicago and public housing. And that is one of the reasons why public housing is being knocked down today, because over time political decisions were made that were detrimental to the upkeep and the maintenance of public housing. That wasn't the primary concern with housing. The concern was to get key constituents in there and to feed the Democratic patronage machine. That's related to Chicago being a Democratic town. In New York City, the mayor after mayor after mayor never was able to harness and hold on to the public housing authority. They never had the power to use it for patronage reasons, at least to the extent that happened in Chicago. So New York's public housing authority really focused on maintaining their buildings and focused on building and maintaining quality housing. So when we look at the redevelopment that's occurring today, we have to look at the context that public housing legislation at the national level was critical, repealing the one-for-one replacement, but also the history and the political decisions that were made in each of these cities over time relates to why all the public housing is being knocked down in Chicago, why the redevelopment is associated with 17,000 people being displaced, and why residents in Harlem are able to sort of benefit potentially from the redevelopment that's occurring there. So what we really see is that the outcomes of redevelopment is really a function of macro variables and an intersection of local political conditions. And it's the interaction of those two levels of analysis that really explain the outcomes in these two different cities. So I also illustrate with the empowerment zone sort of an example with what occurs with how it's implemented in Harlem versus Bronzeville. And we don't have time for that, but that's also in the book for those of you who are interested in the empowerment zone implementation. All right, so I'm sure all of you are wondering, how did a white guy who grew up in New York City's suburbs get interested in inner city development, get interested in Harlem and Bronzeville? And so I just want to take a little bit of time to tell you about that. I mean, my roots in Harlem don't date back to the study. They date back to the late 80s, early 90s, where I played for a basketball team based out of Riverside Church, which is in West Harlem. I played all throughout Harlem, on 135th Street, 155th Street, 116th Street. And I saw the conditions of Harlem in the late 80s, early 90s. You know, the homeless, the drug addicted, the crack vials, the vacant, boarded up brownstones. And that had a huge impact on the way that I saw the world. Not only that, but more importantly, I developed relationships with my teammates. My teammates, most of them either grew up in Harlem or grew up in the Bronx. Their lives compared to mine were completely different. The stressors of growing up in that environment with the drugs, the poor schools, the decaying housing had a huge impact on my teammates' lives. And I saw how that environment impinged upon their life chances. And so what I sort of hope with this book is that it sort of sketches out the dynamics that are affecting urban America. And it can be used to create public policies that in redeveloping areas will allow low-income people to benefit and stay, but also in other areas that are decaying, we can sort of pull some of the lessons from this book to try to develop policies that will help revitalize those areas so that inner city residents and youth, just like the guys on my basketball team, have more of a potential to reach their innate potential. And I want to illustrate one quick thing that one of the events that really struck me when I knew that there was something going on was our coach actually paid for SAT training for those you had to get over 700 to play Division I basketball your first year in college. And so one day after practice, our coach kind of sat us all down and he says, "All right, how many people haven't you had to get a 700 over 700 to reach the level to play?" And he said, "How many people haven't got over 700?" And I really wasn't paying attention. I was kind of looking at the ground. I was thinking about the shots that I had missed that day in practice or something. And I sort of just looked down, raised my hand, figuring most of the guys would raise their hand. But I looked around and I looked down. I was the only one who had gotten over a 700, and I didn't see any difference between my abilities and the abilities of my teammates. But just seeing that I was the only one who even passed this test, I knew that that environment was having a major impact on their potential. So I just wanted to share that with you. All right. Let me conclude. I know we're going to get into some policy discussions. I know this is a presidential year. I'm sure many of you want to talk about some initiatives. I'm just going to sketch out two from, I've laid out a couple of them. I know Marjorie Turner is going to focus on some policy recommendations, but I just want to lay out two from the book. One of the things is that I think what we really need to focus on is we saw with Harlem, the reason that residents are able to, low-income residents are able to stay within the community is because there is viable public housing. Now, there was a lot of distressed public housing, but a lot of it has been knocked down. And we do have some viable public housing around the country. We've got to make sure that the operating funds are maintained. They've been cut for years and years and years. Part of the reason why public housing looks so awful across the country is because we've been cutting that operational fund for maintenance. We've got, for the public housing that remains, we've got to make sure that there's enough funding to maintain that. Otherwise, the public housing that's still left will start to decay. I mean, there's a budget deficit right now, $200 million in the New York City Housing Authority. They've talked about cutting back maintenance. If they cut back maintenance, that housing that remains, that 20,000 people I talked about, the buildings will start to decay, and New York will do the same thing that Chicago did and knock them all down. So then what are we doing? Are we creating mixed income communities, or are we really just sort of pushing the poverty to other areas? And if we don't maintain the public housing that's up, that's what we're going to be doing. The other part is there will be some displacement. A lot of these communities, Harlem, Bronzeville, we're talking 60, 70, 80% of the people that live there were below the poverty line. That's not a healthy community. We do have to have some displacement to build up the income infrastructure in these communities so that there'll be better schools, better amenities. But we need to think about the people who are being displaced. They're not going homeless, they're getting Section 8 vouchers. Well, and what we're seeing with the Section 8 voucher program is poverty is actually reconcentrating in the inner suburbs. So we're not really spreading the poverty out. We are a little bit, but what's happening is over time we are probably going to have high poverty neighborhoods. Instead of being in the inner city, they're going to be in the inner suburbs. Well, we know what inner city or inner suburb poverty looks like. Just look at France today. Look what's happening there. They're having riots. Those communities are burning down. So just pushing the poverty from the inner city to the inner suburb isn't doing anything. We've got to create a Section 8 voucher program that creates better opportunities for people to get in low poverty neighborhoods. There's been a lot of research on this, and we need to do mobility counseling. We have to put resources behind that so people end up in low poverty areas when they leave the inner city. One other thing is poverty is increasing in the inner suburbs. We know this. I mean, it's a fact. We've got to start putting resources in these areas. The Community Development Block Grant is about a $4 billion program a year that money gets allocated primarily to cities. Well, the poverty is moving to the inner suburbs. We've got to get some of this Community Development Block Grant to those areas so that they can deal with the poverty that's emerging in those areas. So those are the couple of policy recommendations that I thought were key that I wanted to elaborate on, and I think I'm looking forward to just sort of continuing the discussion with the panelists, and so I will turn it over to them. Who's next up? But thank you.
Next we'll hear from Mary Pattillo. Do you want to stay there?
I'm going to stay here because I'm already plugged in and my battery's low. So thank you all for coming. Thanks to the Wilson Center for having me here. Thanks to Derek for recommending me. It really was a treat to get it right off the press. I had read it in previous forms, but it's always good to see it between two hardcovers. And the author took this photograph. You must be a photographer in your side life because this is really an impressive photograph. So I just noticed that and wanted to commend you for that. So a number of scholars are interested in the transformation, renewal, revitalization, gentrification of black communities across the country, myself included. And there are a number of books out there, as Derek mentioned, and duly cites and discusses in the New Urban Renewal. So let me start by saying just one of the many things that I think that I think is innovative and unique about the new urban renewal. As I said, there are many things. I'm going to just focus on one because perhaps it was the biggest weakness in my own work. Derek did in his book, what a reviewer of my own book that was mentioned previously said I must do, and I just couldn't figure out how to do, and that's to connect the local to the global. And so I put it in a little footnote in my own book, but Derek really spends a whole chapter talking about the importance of globalization, linking the transformations of Bronzeville and Harlem to globalization. While I'm sure even more could have been done about the relevance of mortgage-backed securities and the connections to subprime lending and so on, what I think Derek does best is illustrate that the primary importance comes from the pressure that new people are putting on downtown areas and the intensification of land use that then pushes on the boundaries of neighborhoods nearby, including places like Harlem and Bronzeville. Derek shows that the population of the Loop in Chicago, for example, increased 37% between 1990 and 2000, whereas the city population only increased by 4%. Those newcomers are workers in the global economy, workers in the command and control centers, which are New York and Chicago, workers in the finance and real estate, professional services, and the like. We all know these people. Many of us are these people. My partner, for example, is one of them. He works for a company that makes software for futures traders who used to be primarily arbing in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which Derek mentions, but are now all on their computer screens across the world and have transformed from using their hands and arbing to using complex mathematical algorithms. And my partner lives right across the street from where he lives. This is kind of the quintessential global worker in the quintessential global industry in the Mercantile Exchange. We all know the importance of labels for real estate marketing, so witness this following narrative for a new loft building in Chicago. Quote, "An historic Chicago warehouse that once housed the sets of the Lyric Opera of Chicago will be converted into luxury lofts. The building, located at the south end of the Chicago Loop at 2545 South Dearborn Street, will have a total of 93 units." I don't know how many of you all know Chicago, but get Derek's book with his maps, and you will see that 2545 South Dearborn is not a place that many people thought was at the south end of the Loop. In fact, is in Bronzeville. So this use of language to expand the downtown areas are part of this globalization and the pressure pushing further. So then I tried to find a similar example for New York, and I thought immediately about Columbia's expansion. Full disclosure, Columbia is my alma mater, so I get all the glossy things about Columbia, and so I just knew they were going to have some word tricks about their expansion, and I thought I caught them because on their webpage they have a link on the front page that says Manhattanville planning updates, and I saw, see, they're not calling it Harlem. But when you click on it, they actually say, quote, "While Columbia is a globally respected academic center, it is also a vital local New York institution committed to the economic, intellectual, social, and cultural vitality of our neighborhoods. In that spirit, together with our West Harlem neighbors, with our West Harlem neighbors, elected officials, and civic leaders, Columbia has developed a plan for a mixed-income academic center that provides a long-term future of shared opportunity in the old Manhattanville manufacturing zone of West Harlem." So they kind of walk the line a little bit there between using the term Manhattanville and using the term Harlem. My guess is that other developers who are building north of 110th Street in Central Harlem are not so politically correct. Maybe Central Park North or something like that might be creeping into the marketing language of people building. Again, the residents, the creative class, plus all the rest of us want to be in the action, and we'll get rid of our cars to be able to walk to work or to train it to go to dinner or to go to the movies, a play, a concert, and of course always be ready to go to the airport. Surely there are other scholars who are linking gentrification to the global labor and investment markets, but that literature is often very conceptual. It's very speculative. It talks about neoliberalism, but it never really connects in any concrete way, the way that Derek has, the global to the local. So having highlighted what I think is unique about the new urban renewal, let me now turn to 2 points that I see as common in this book and much of the other literature about gentrification and black gentrification in particular. Derek's book, I think, pushes me in particular and many of us to think further about questions that all of us are addressing in our own research. So let me talk about 2 points on this front. The first is the role of black professionals in the transformation of Harlem and Bronzeville. And the second is a more general issue about perspectives on the urban ideal, or basically what is the ideal that we are striving for here. So first, the role of black professionals. So don't you hate when you're reading an op-ed and you think, I should have wrote that op-ed. I should have written that op-ed. First, you should think in proper grammar. I should have written that op-ed. So I had that experience this morning when I got an email from a friend who forwarded me an op-ed. The op-ed was called, quote, "When the Man is One of Us," and it was written by Jack Wright on theroot.com. Really, really interesting. And White writes that Jesse Jackson Sr.'s recent, quote, "stunningly inappropriate comments symbolize the social, political, and psychological vertigo that all of us, and especially black Americans, are experiencing because of Obama's success. We are all, including Obama, in a place we never really thought we would be, and it has knocked us off of our feet. We don't know how to act. We don't have a plan. We're searching for our equilibrium. And until we regain our footing, we can expect all sorts of bizarre behavior from people who ought to know better. We're not really ready for the day when the man becomes a black man." So I thought, shoot, I should have written that. And the reason I should have written it is because in my own book, which is on a neighborhood just east of the one that Derek studies, I wrote the following, quote, "In everyday slang, there is the little man, the middle man, and at the top is just the man. For African Americans, the man is usually white. Every city has its police department," wrote Eldridge Cleaver in 1968, when Los Angeles' police department was still overwhelmingly white. "No city would be complete without one. It would be sheer madness to try operating an American city without the heat, the fuzz, the man. The little man, on the other hand, is not always so racialized. Thurgood Marshall was known as the little man's lawyer. The man and the little man flank the middle man." So in my own research, I go on to develop this concept of the black middleman, who can, of course, also be a woman. So the black middleman and black middle woman in the neighborhood that I study. These are people who are working to combat the racism that have created neighborhoods like Harlem and Bronzeville through very purposeful attempts at racial segregation and the building up of concentrated poverty. But they do so by making alliances with many people that are the descendants of the people who initially built those neighborhoods to begin with. While desiring to improve the situation for disadvantaged black folks, they sometimes serve as black brokers for white power. Audre Lorde had a critique of this, and she wrote, quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." So this is the frustrating dilemma of the black middlemen, filled with the good racial uplift intentions that Derek talks about, but bound within a system of strategies that sometimes works in the opposite direction. So there are plenty of middlemen and middle women in Derek's book. As I was reading it, I kept circling the names and writing in the margins. They came up about the empowerment zone funding quite frequently. And Derek writes, quote, "For Mayor Daley, a strategic allocation of the empowerment zone funds and city resources has been useful in garnering political support from nonprofit organizations in African American communities." So this role of the heads of nonprofits, these heads of nonprofits were often what I would term black middlemen and middle women. But this isn't just a matter of machine politics co-opting all possible challengers. New York also has its share of middlemen and middle women in the story. For example, here is a consummate example of a black middle woman in Harlem. The compromise between Democrats and I'm reading from Derek's book, between Democrats and Republicans is evident in the appointment of the UMEZ's first CEO, Deborah Wright, a 3-time Harvard graduate with advanced degrees in law and business. Before heading to the UMEZ, she was the director of the New York City's Department of Housing Preservation and Development under Mayor Giuliani. Miss Wright, an African American, also previously worked for the Dinkins administration and was well known by the Harlem political elites. Her experience working with both the New York City Democrats and Republicans helped her navigate the competing priorities of the UMEZ board members. This description of Deborah Wright is the kind of example that I give in my own research. Someone who has all of the bona fides to make them legitimate, perhaps we might even use the word authentic, leader in the black community. She had lived in Harlem for 20-some years, maybe even more, probably even more, I think. And then also she had the kind of credentials to say, you know, I've lived in Harlem for decades, but she also had these other credentials, a Harvard graduate, to make her comfortable with other members, with the white power, as I talk about black brokers and white power. So my discussion of middlemen highlights these combination of identities and this ability to broker between two worlds. I also argue that these middlemen actually can go both ways. And here is where my own research characterizes things a little bit differently than Derek, and I think we could have some discussion and debate about kind of where the amplification and emphasis might be. So let me read another example, perhaps a little uncomfortable with Assemblyman Wright sitting here, but I think it's a good example of another middleman example. So here, Assemblyman Wright, yes, he explains that this is an example that Derek's giving when Assemblyman Wright goes to a local community organization that's trying to oppose a new home for single mothers on their block. He, Assemblyman Wright, explains that this social service agency has a good reputation. The agency is based in Harlem. And that the church that owns the land could place another social service agency on this corner with fewer community ties. The block club is not convinced. In fact, as Keith finishes his comments, the vice president of the block club hands out a list of all the social services agencies in the neighborhood and says, enough is enough. There's some other things, and then ... Mignon, who is Assemblyman Wright's assistant, rolls her eyes when the new residents say enough is enough and don't want this home for single mothers on their block. Mignon has lived in Harlem all her entire life. She grew up in the Lincoln Houses, a public housing project, and raised 2 sons as a single mother. She was a frank woman who has worked for Keith for almost 10 years. After the meeting, she tells me this program could help some of the young single mothers in the community. While elaborating on the program's potential, she says she hates the implants. Affluent people who move to Harlem, buy brownstones, and drive up property values without any concern for long-term low-income residents. Mignon is passionate about her contempt for implants because she closely identifies with long-term residents and despises newcomers who claim Harlem solely for themselves. So what I think this is an example of, both on the part of Assemblyman Wright and on by his assistant, is the way in which black middlemen and middlewomen are brokers in both directions. So they're both black brokers for white power, but they're also black brokers and spokesmen for disadvantaged residents in this community. And here's an example when Assemblyman Wright was trying to convince these newcomers that a home for single mothers on their block was not going to be the end of the world and in fact would be a good thing. He wasn't ultimately successful, but that ability to kind of broker for both sides of the fence, I think, is something that isn't particularly amplified here in the book. And I think there are many examples of black middlemen and middlewomen, newcomers to these neighborhoods, who do that exact kind of brokering.
Mary, you just got Mignon fired.
Maybe a raise.
That's what I would think. He was only agreeing. She was only agreeing. So the op-ed that I quoted in the beginning asks, what do we do when the man is a black man? Here, the author in the op-ed author is referring to, of course, the ultimate man, as in the President of the United States. But in both Chicago and New York, in Bronzeville and in Harlem, sometimes it was unclear in my own research and even in reading Derek's if these people are actually middlemen or if they're actually the man. So Deborah Wright was quite powerful. And in Chicago, people like Valerie Jarrett, for example, who is, of course, very connected with Barack, is also quite powerful. And it's not quite clear where the middleman and the man, where that line begins to begin and end. How much time do I have left?
5 minutes.
Great. So I have one last point. Let me think. Okay, so So the final point that the new urban renewal pushes me to think about is, what do we really want? So this is the question about urban ideals. So key to answering this, of course, is to specify who we is in the sentence, what do we really want? What do we really want? Who is we? What do city planners, bureaucrats, and politicians want? What do black folks want? And of course, we know that means, what do black gentrifiers want, and what do black old-timer residents want? What do progressive observers and scholars want? What does Derek Hyra want for Bronzeville in Harlem? What do I want for North Kenwood, Oakland, which is the neighborhood that I study? So what do we want is not an easy question, but the book really pushes me to think about this. I was struck by these questions, particularly as I read the discussion of the empowerment zones in both Chicago and Harlem. They were not comparable, as Derek points out, because Chicago focused on social services, whereas New York focused on business development. And thus, I was actually a little concerned that the evaluation metrics for if they were successful were not quite perhaps appropriate. So the evaluation metric was the employment, increases in jobs. But of course, since Chicago focused on social services, the evaluation metric might be something like, were there fewer cases of drug addiction, or was there better child care, or was there less food insecurity? So those kinds of things might have been a more appropriate question. But nonetheless, in comparing these two places, there was always a moment, there was always this feeling of simultaneous celebration and critique. So in comparing the two, it was as if neither was completely acceptable, neither focusing on social services nor focusing on business development. Harlem got all the big box stores and the jobs that came along with it, and that was celebrated. But those big box stores ran out the mom and pop businesses and changed the character of the neighborhood, taking away its symbolic blackness. Bronzeville, on the other hand, which invested in social services, basically has almost no commercial investment still. It's still struggling on the retail end, except for some very small, the spas and so on. But the spas are often black-owned. They're small. They come and go. The coffee shops come and go. So it's maintaining its black identity, but it hasn't gotten the job boost. It hasn't gotten the diversity of commerce, those kinds of things. Which is better? What do we want? The same is true of the controversy around public housing. Chicago's situation was dire, but the remedy of demolishing 20,000 units in the city as a whole, the figures that Derek gave was for Bronzeville in particular, this remedy was drastic, poorly carried out, and has dispossessed thousands of families from their social support networks and left them out of improving neighborhoods. New York City's not tearing down its public housing, but it might have a different problem, the problem of a very unbalanced mix of skyrocketing and outrageously priced market rate housing, and then public housing for the very low-income families with not much in the middle. So they're not building mixed-income communities that often include this moderate income component in the middle. So which is better? What do we want? Even for black gentrifiers, and I would argue actually white gentrifiers, it's unclear what we want. And these are questions we continue to struggle with. We moved to Bronzeville and Harlem. We should know what we're getting into. We should know where we're moving, both in terms of all of its storied history and also its gritty reality. And yet we get there and we complain. Derek has a quote, "Where you once had a grandmother, now you have 4 daughters with 5 kids apiece." One gentrifier complains about displaced public housing residents doubling up in the private market rental housing on her block. We complain, another resident, "I'm tired of poor people. I don't care about poor people. I want some good homeowners in the community. We need more homeowners." That was a resident in Harlem. People in my own research complain about people barbecuing and people hanging out, people fixing their cars on the street, people honking their horns. We complain. And of course, many people have probably read the recent New York Times piece where the new residents in Harlem are complaining about the drummers in Mount Morris Park. You move to Harlem. The drummers have been drumming in Mount Morris Park for decades. What do we want? So I think all of these kinds of questions, and I didn't even bring up the questions where I think actually many of us fit in, which is what do we progressive urban scholars and policymakers want, also I think are things that come to bear. And I struggled with this in my own writing because I feel at the end of the day we get a little schizophrenic, that we describe things as both good and bad, and what trade-offs are we willing to make when there are consequences for some good things. So I will end there, and thank you again very much for having me, and I look forward to some more discussion.
Thank you, and let me add my thanks for the opportunity to be here. I enjoyed this book very much, and I agree with some of the points Mary's made about what makes it unique. But I think my role is to push the conversation in a policy direction, and sort of to expand on what I see as its policy implications going forward. So in some ways, I think this builds off Mary's question of what is it we want, what is it we're trying to get. So I want to start that conversation by being really explicit that I believe past policies, the policies for much of the 20th century around housing and urban neighborhoods, were destructive policies. They were racially discriminatory and segregative, and we don't want to repeat them. So by those policies, I'm including building housing projects that were earmarked exclusively for poor people, citing those projects in poor neighborhoods, depriving those communities of needed resources, both from the public sector and from the private sector, reinforcing market patterns of racial separation and racial isolation, and generally fueling disinvestment in inner city communities. Now, all the problems of inner cities for most of the 20th century can't be laid at the feet of federal policy, but federal policy sure did a good job of reinforcing and rigidifying market forces that were fundamentally prejudiced, in my view. So I personally feel strongly that we have an obligation not just to do better than that going forward, but to use the policy tools at our disposal to correct, to reverse some of the effects of these past policy failures. So when I think about what I want out of these kinds of policies, I'm thinking about attracting non-poor people and the investments and the amenities that follow them into neighborhoods that were previously isolated by their very high rates of poverty. I want to replace those projects, those earmarked projects, with truly mixed income housing developments that include substantial numbers of apartments that are deeply subsidized so that they're accessible even for the poorest people. And I want to help poor families who rely on housing assistance of one form or another make their own decisions about what neighborhood, what location, where's the best place for them to be living. So in a lot of ways, this book is the story of an initial round of efforts along those lines, an initial round of imperfect efforts along those lines that occurred over the last 15 years, which have achieved a mixed story of success. As we know from the book and from our own experience, some previously distressed neighborhoods are indeed experiencing a pretty astonishing revitalization. Harlem and Bronzeville are examples. Columbia Heights and Shaw here in D.C. started a little later, but are on the same kind of trajectory. In a lot of cases, families who were living in truly horrible places, destructive, dangerous places, many of those families have been relocated, often with housing assistance, they feel safer and the housing they're living in is better. We're starting to build and see on the ground mixed income developments that do provide, at least it appears, much better quality housing in a much better environment, although for a much smaller number of very low income households. And I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that in addition, we now believe that central cities can come back, that central cities can be really exciting, lively, vital places where lots of different kinds of people want to live. And I think if you had said that in 1989, you might have been sort of laughed out of the room. So that's all pretty remarkable. But I also agree with Mary and with Derek that we aren't getting it right yet. So for me, as a policy muddler, when you're not getting it right yet, it doesn't mean you stop and give up or say, oh, whoops, maybe concentrating all those poor people in horrible projects is the best we can do. I think it means you take an honest look at what you've gotten right and what you don't like about what you're getting now, and you try to push incrementally further to correct those problems and get the next round of experimentation a little bit better. So some people call me a Pollyanna for that point of view, but essentially that's what I think this kind of research should be helping us do, is get it a little bit more right in the next go-around. So I want to sort of acknowledge the things that I think we're not getting right yet, and they're serious. We now have in some places, not all places, market forces that have run away with us. We invested a tremendous amount of public resources to get the private market going in some of these communities, and yikes! All of a sudden, it almost worked more than we imagined possible in some places, and we're now seeing a tremendous amount of displacement, and beyond displacement, exclusion. I think it's important to acknowledge that when a neighborhood that was previously home for a minority community or a low-income community, the fact that new generations of young people of that group can't imagine moving into that neighborhood because they're just completely priced out of it, that's a part of the displacement story. It's not that they lived there and they got booted out, but people had seen it as theirs, and now it's not available to them at all. So I think that's a serious problem. We have dramatically reduced the total stock of subsidized, affordable housing units. In effect, we've done income mixing one way, but not the mirror way. We have mixed higher income people into places that were previously all poor and affordable. We have not successfully overcome the NIMBY issues and mixed affordable housing into neighborhoods that were previously exclusive. I know this is really tough to do. We need to be working on both sides of the income mixing story at the same time. In a lot of cases, poor families really haven't had much of a voice in planning for these new communities. And that sort of reinforces this notion, an entirely legitimate notion, that a whole other set of powers are in control here, and that the concerns of the original residents don't carry much weight. In some communities, families who receive vouchers to relocate are having a lot of trouble using those, particularly in hot markets with these global pressures. And even in softer markets where vouchers work for a lot of people, the most vulnerable families, who people variously call hard to house or hard to serve, the most vulnerable families are falling through the cracks. Finally, a concern of mine is that we are really not making much progress towards racial integration in this process of gentrification. And I want to come back to that at the very end. So given my view that we should acknowledge those failures of our latest round of policy experimentation, but try to figure out how to address those failures moving forward. The first thing we need is a federal government that cares about these issues at all. The action has to happen at the local level, and it needs to be tailored at the local level. But no community development corporation, no city government can address these deep, complex problems of affordable housing and neighborhood disinvestment without federal resources. So the notion that somehow the cities and communities have to fix this by themselves is just nutty. So we need really a lot more federal money. I think that federal money it doesn't need to come with dictatorial rules about exactly how it should be used, but it does need to come with some important mandates, like legitimate citizen engagement and allocation of resources to prevent displacement, and maybe investment in small businesses that were there at the outset. I mean, there are some criteria that you can impose in conjunction with significant federal resources. And in a way, that combination of money and mandates is what we mean by leadership. And federal leadership is what I would argue we had in a big chunk of the 1990s, and we have been without since. So I have a moderately short list of policy priorities. We know now what we didn't know 15 years ago. We actually can get distressed central city neighborhoods to turn around. We can get the market back in. We can get market forces working again. So now we got to figure out how to intervene early in that process and preserve affordable housing options, so that the low-income people get to stay and benefit from the turnaround. And I think the New York example, that because New York's public housing had not been run into the ground essentially by incompetence and corruption, New York had a stock of public housing that could remain in those neighborhoods, and it's made a big difference. I think I've said that public investments and subsidies for private development should go hand in hand with really meaningful mandates for resident engagement. And there are ways not just to say that and make it sound nice, but to pay for it and enforce it. So communities are experimenting with enforceable community benefits agreements, so that the developers with money have to negotiate with residents, and then the city comes in behind and enforces the terms of the agreement that was negotiated. We need to create more low-cost housing options in non-poor communities. And there are a lot of ways to do it. Inclusionary zoning is a tool. The low-income housing tax credit could be better targeted so that it puts the subsidized units in opportunity-rich, healthy neighborhoods. We can use project-based vouchers, which are like a little unit's worth of public housing subsidy that can get plopped into some units in really nice projects in nice neighborhoods. I'll be glad to expand on my view that the voucher program, if effectively administered with strong mobility counseling, can be a really positive tool for families and for communities. And finally, I think we need to invest in a serious way in community building to help old and new residents learn to talk to each other, learn to listen to each other, and learn to live together. Because I actually think a lot of people, black and white, who move to central city neighborhoods want some grit and want the diversity. But then they get there and they realize they don't know how to talk about the issues that arise. They don't know how to negotiate with their neighbors. And that investments in helping people learn how to live in the same neighborhood could really pay off. I want to close with a question, though, a sort of broader question. And that is that if you believe, as I do, that racial segregation and racial exclusion played a central role in creating neighborhood disinvestment and neighborhood distress, is it okay now, in the 21st century, for neighborhoods to remain racially homogeneous as they revitalize? I know this is a very sensitive question and a difficult question, and one that's hard to talk about. I'm not arguing that neighborhoods like Bronzeville and Harlem somehow have to have white people in them in order to thrive. That shouldn't be the case. We don't want to be a country in which a neighborhood has to have white people in it to be okay. But I think there are still real grounds for concern in our country that predominantly minority neighborhoods, predominantly black neighborhoods, even with upper income professionals living in them, may continue to experience discrimination and disinvestment by private investors and by government. Cheryl Cashin's book on the failures of integration makes this argument. I live in Prince George's County, an affluent black suburb, and I think I see my community being starved of some essential resources on the basis of its race. And in addition to that, I really believe that residential separation hurts all of us. I think it perpetuates misunderstanding, and hence it perpetuates prejudice. So that doesn't mean that I think that every neighborhood in the country has to be somehow this perfect blend, but I do think that separate but equal isn't an acceptable outcome. It isn't what I want for our country. So going forward, it's not so much an issue posed by this book, but I think we're really making a mistake if we pretend that race doesn't matter anymore as we plan for and evaluate the revitalization we want for distressed Central City communities.
Well, I think we all know a little bit about Assemblyman Wright, even if we didn't before we entered the room. So this is his chance to speak.
Good afternoon. I must say that I've been absolutely riveted and on the edge of my seat listening to these two intellectuals and scholars talk about Derek's book and all of the things going on in the orbit of the book. I guess I'll try and keep my comments. I must confess I have not even read the book, and I just got the book 2 days ago. And I guess in a former life when Derek was working with me, and I'd have to come to one of these things and to act like I knew what I was talking about, Derek would probably have written some notes for me and probably would have put it in front of me and told me just to read it back verbatim, and then I would probably act like I would know that what I was talking about. But he did not do that today. And but it's absolutely fascinating, I guess, the subject matter. And although I have not read the book, I can, honestly say that I've lived a lot of the book. Just in terms of background, I live in the exact same rent-stabilized apartment on 135th Street in Harlem. I live in that I grew up in. With the birth of my 2 children, makes 5 generations my family has been in Harlem. I'm not going anywhere. My rent of my small 3-bedroom apartment is $916 a month. Which is very cheap for New York standards. Let me just say this. One of the... I guess I'll try and, categorize my comments economic, political, cultural. I am not going to be that organized, and if I meander, and please don't hold it against me, but I'll try and keep some form of organization here. I guess it was back in the 1980s in Harlem, and I'm not one of these firm, rabid proponents of, just recognizing, I wish we could go back to the good old days. Because the good old days weren't all that good in a lot of ways. It was back in the 1980s when, I guess, the first few steps coming in terms of trying to revitalize the community of Harlem were starting to take place. I don't know anything about Bronzeville, so I cannot speak to Bronzeville. But it was with a guy by the name of Percy Sutton who first started to, who bought the Apollo Theater after, I guess, about a decade of it being closed. And that was how 125th Street, which is our main economic corridor, commercial corridor, started to get jump-started again. With that, and I guess I just have to say that, yes, we have some white folks moving uptown right now. And I do firmly believe that white folks are not coming uptown to Harlem because they like black people so much. They are coming uptown because they have nowhere else to live also. Some of these housing policies that you were talking about have affected white folks as well. And it's not just in New York, it's everywhere. When you have to pay, $3,500, $4,000 for a small studio apartment in Manhattan, downtown, coming uptown to Harlem doesn't look so bad anymore. And where I guess an apartment is more affordable for you, for those folks that can afford it. Now, I guess this so-called renaissance that's happening to Harlem progress has been a double-edged sword in many, many respects. I have represented Harlem. It's been a privilege to do so for the last 16 years. If you want to get a picture of it, I guess you folks down here in Washington, Congressman Rangel lives across the street, and I actually sit in the same assembly seat that Congressman Rangel sat in before he became went on to Congress, and Derek actually lived the experience. When I first met Derek, I still fancy myself a relatively good basketball player, and every Saturday I play at the Harlem Y, which is everyone knows what the Harlem Y is. It's where Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, everyone, I guess, started out and, learned their craft. So one Saturday, playing with the neighborhood folks, young, everybody's young, 18 years old, 19 years old. And Derek comes with but we didn't know they were his teammates, but with some other white cats walking up into the Harlem YMCA's gym. Not many white folks walk up into that gym. But Derek comes up with about 3 or 4 of them. So the black guys in the gym swore, okay, we got some white cats here who we can beat. Derek lets me play on the gym because I'm the older guy, so I don't necessarily get a chance to play with the younger guys. But Derek said, all right, let's go. You come on our team. Well, whereupon these guys, I think we beat the younger guys, about 16-4. And they just couldn't believe it. That these white guys came in and beat them. And I was happy because I got to play another game. And thereupon our friendship started right then and there. Then he told me he needed a job and I better hire him. So, and I did so right away. But anyway, he became a part of the fabric of the neighborhood, became a part of the fabric of my family. My children still ask for him and still talk to him, eating many a Chinese food dinner over at my house, I believe. Right? Yeah. I didn't cook it, right? All right. So no, absolutely not. So he's sat with my mother, and so he definitely became part of the family. Anyway, so I guess, and I'm surprised because we we went through the whole nitty gritty of what was going on up in Harlem. It's let me just say this: when we in our community planning boards, our precinct councils, our community school board meetings, when all of this so-called progress was going on, it wasn't planned the way that you see it now. There were no banks in Harlem back in the 80s. There was virtually no home ownership whatsoever. So what we were trying to do was to preserve the neighborhood of Harlem and the character of the neighborhood of Harlem. What has happened, I think, because of some of the political influences, is that we've gone a bit overboard. What do I mean by that? Well, back in the 1980s, and Derek has mentioned names, folks like David Dinkins, Basil Patterson, the governor's father, Charlie Rangel, and those folks. We were talking about how we can improve, and I was in on some of those meetings, and how we can improve the neighborhood, and we had to have, I guess, some political leadership in place. Well, when David Dinkins got elected in 1989. All of this, and we had Governor Cuomo in the State House. We had figured out a partnership that we were going to get going and to help revitalize the Harlem neighborhood. And back then, you have to remember, I mean, I guess Derek said, public housing may have not done if it's responsible for a few things, it's responsible for being able to elect some black politicians. Well, some black politicians were absolutely able to do some good and show some vision, as far as I'm concerned. One of the things that they did was that you have to have certain people in place in order to create some good, sound policies. Well, when David Dinkins got elected in 1989 as the mayor, chief executive officer of the mayor at Mayor of the City of New York, you have to remember a lot of New York, and especially in Harlem, 80% of the land was owned by the City of New York. 80% of the land in Harlem was owned by the City of New York. I'm talking about the buildings, the vacant lots, just the streets, everything. And Harlem was so undeveloped. It was the new frontier in a lot of respects. It was undeveloped. Landlords had walked away from properties. Nothing was just going toward the tax rolls. It was the new frontier. It was open, wide open for development. Well, Mayor Dinkins had I think, some good sound policies that he was planning in order to redevelop Harlem, because he was from Harlem also, and he knew the importance of it. But no one ever expected a guy by the name of Rudolph Giuliani to beat him. So when you have the chief executive officer of the City of New York, who's in charge of 80% of the vacant land, that's a lot of land to play with. So here comes Mayor Giuliani now, basically saying, okay, you don't find a lot of developers that want to develop low-income properties. You don't find a lot of developers that want to develop low to moderate income properties, but you find a lot of developers that would love to develop luxury properties. So Rudolph Giuliani, now being in charge of 80% of the land in Harlem, now has a chance to help his developer friends. So essentially, in a lot of the vacant-owned properties, we now have condominiums uptown. Condominiums, and I guess when I first started out in elective life in Harlem, I was considered a person of, I guess, upper income. Let me just say this. In New York State, some person makes $80,000 a year. You ain't going to get rich doing this stuff. But in Harlem, I was considered to I had a lot of money. I knew I had a lot of money because every time I'd walk down the street, somebody would ask me for something. But now, there's no way I can move into these $1 million condominiums. and of which there are quite a few. So that's essentially what happened. When you have 80% of the real estate uptown controlled by the mayor of the city of New York, who basically has total say of where to, where to give, what land to give to these developers. That's what happened, I guess, in the early '90s, certainly to the end of his tenure. Now, some aspect, Harlem, when I was growing up in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, I guess I would say 100% of the neighborhood was 95% was black. Now, when you see a white person coming from downtown, I don't know how many of you know the New York City subway system, but when they were thinking they were going to Columbia University, they get on the number 1 train and get off at 116th Street. Well, when they get on the number 2 train or the number 3 train and they get off on 116th Street and Lenox Avenue, they were in a panic. They didn't know what to do. But now, of course, it's totally different. So, and I remember the old days, and talking about the Columbia expansion, I remember a friend of mine got into Columbia University, and they received, I guess, the student handbook. And one of the first items in the student handbook was that, you're a Columbia student, do not go above 123rd Street, because Columbia University cannot be responsible for you. And they just didn't say that that's where all the blacks live, so you have to be careful. But now, certainly, it's ironic that Columbia University wants to totally expand up to 135th Street now, because like every college, they need to expand. So, and that's where we are. I do want to say, in one of those community meetings that we were talking about, there was a hot summer night community meeting. I don't know if you were at that meeting, Derek. And we were talking about barbecuing. Some of the newer residents who read the brochures about the luxury condominiums, not in Central Park North, but what they call NOHA. Do you know what NOHA stands for? North Harlem. This is a new phrase. Or SOHA, South Harlem. Because some of the newer residents, the white residents, were upset about the smells being emanating from the barbecue pits in the park across the street from where they lived. Well, and talking about, and it was a hot community meeting. So finally, one black lady got up and says, "You know what? We don't mind you white folks coming up here. It's okay. We're people too. But you know what?" Well, we have Avery in the room. I can't quote. Give the whole quote.
You'll be all right.
Yeah. But you MFs don't even say good morning when you're walking your dogs. So talking about, maybe some money to train folks to say good morning, which is very important because, let me just say this. It's important. Most elected officials, right now, certainly in New York, we're trying to preserve the characters of neighborhoods. Let's not forget that Harlem is a neighborhood. It's a neighborhood like Chinatown. It's a neighborhood like Chelsea. It's a neighborhood like Greenwich Village. It's a neighborhood like Little Italy, but it's still in Manhattan. Now, the real estate market has been taking a tumble everywhere throughout this nation. In Manhattan, it's gone up. The average price for a condominium in Manhattan right now today is $1.9 million. The average price, which is absolutely phenomenal, which shows a lot about my business and real estate acumen, that I live in my same old rent-stabilized apartment paying rent. Anyway, be that as it may. I think there's another study that has come out showing that black folks, especially our retirees, are leaving the 5 boroughs in the city of New York. because it's just getting too expensive. And so I guess, economics comes into play here. And and I think somewhere, and I'm getting that look like I better shut up right now. So, yeah, I know the look. Believe me. It happens quite often in people in my position. So I just want to say that I'm certainly happy to be here. I do promise to read the book, Derek.
There'll be a quiz.
There'll be a quiz at the end, and I am Saturday. Just to let you know, to give you some sort of inkling as to some of my political philosophy, is that someone was talking about the drummer's circle in Marcus Garvey Park. Marcus Garvey Park. Just because you spend $1.5 million in order to invest in an apartment, it doesn't mean that you totally are able to dictate the cultural, social mores of a community, as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to, and I've never done so, but I'm going to play one of those drums in Marcus Garvey Park on Saturday. So with that, I will shut up, and thank you for allowing me to meander and speak in support of my main man, Derek's book.
Be careful, no terrorist gestures. I want to, I'm going to give Derek the floor, and I wanted to try to frame the discussion. And I have to say, before Assemblyman Wright spoke, I was going to frame it differently, but I think he really got to the heart of the matter as I listened to the presentations and I think about Derek's book. Derek's book is a remarkable book for all the different reasons you've been hearing. One of them is, as Marjorie pointed out, it is a very good illustration of a fundamental policy problem, which is once you solve a problem, you create other problems. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that the policy process is always incremental in the ways that she described. But I think Mary, in a way, posed a question which we had two different answers from Derek and from Assemblyman Wright about, is what do we want? And what's interesting for me is the starting point of the policies examined by Derek. This isn't so much what he wanted, but what the policies were trying to address, was the problem of concentrated poverty. The challenges Assemblyman Wright just described, as he himself said, are the problems of preserving a community. Those are two very different challenges, and it seems to me that, Derek, you have identified one of the reasons why we can take great, I won't say pleasure, that's too strong, but we can be pleased by the fact that if you take a look at the macro demographic data, Harlem has changed. It's been renewed, is the way you describe it. Bronzeville has. If you took those data and showed policymakers in 1980, look, this is Harlem 25 years from now, they wouldn't believe you and they would say this is wonderful. And yet we don't feel as if it's wonderful, because what hasn't been preserved is community. What's been preserved, it's also interesting the way race enters in, because race, the African American experience, has become an acceptable marketing tool if it's sanitized in some way. You go to U Street, it's Duke Ellington's neighborhood. Well, Duke Ellington is a wonderful man. It's great he's going to be on 25-cent piece. But he is a symbol for that community that doesn't challenge the new people moving in. You don't see condominiums called the Stokely for Stokely Carmichael or the Julius for Julius Hobson. You see the Ellington. And it seems to me that one of the issues here has to do with exactly what you talk about, globalization. And globalization homogenizes. Starbucks is Starbucks is Starbucks. So after hearing all of this, Derek, how do you preserve communities and achieve the kinds of successful policies from a certain point of view that you describe in this book?
All right, well, I'll take a stab at this one. Actually, But I don't want to take too much time because I know we have a lot of people, and I'm glad you're all here. And I know
I'm not letting you off the hook that
Oh, no. But I will answer the question. Well, what's great is Mary talked about, writing the op-ed that you wish you had written. Well, I've written an op-ed that hasn't been published yet, which is with one of the papers, which hopefully will be coming out this Sunday. But it is exactly on this question. And the title of the op-ed is Harlem Losing Its Soul? And it sort of looks at, with the redevelopment that's going on, is it preserving its cultural identity? And it sort of plays with that issue in the op-ed. And I think that's something that I didn't tackle fully in the book. I mean, you can only talk about so many things. And but I would say this. Let me just take a step back, and then I'll answer the question. My goal is based on looking at the research. The research we know is areas that are 40% plus in poverty, you're going to have neighborhood effects. You're going to have elevated rates of, I ticked it off, teen pregnancy, school dropout, poor health outcomes, beyond what would be predicted by knowing the characteristics of the individuals living in those communities. If we drop the poverty rate in these census tracts below 40, we go to 30, we go to 20, we will not have, or we should not have, based on the research, these neighborhood effects. So, goal number one is to deconcentrate the poverty. Now, there are repercussions to doing that. Harlem is a perfect example. Harlem is going to go, it probably did during 2000, we'll find out in 2010 census, but it went below 40. I mean, it was at 45 in the 2000 census. It probably went below 40% poverty. But now we have a different Harlem. I mean, we have, instead of the symbol of black America, Harlem, to some extent, has become the symbol of corporate America. We had the Disney store. Keith talked about how it was there for a time period.
They couldn't make it.
They couldn't survive. We've got H&M. We've got Starbucks. I mean, we have a lot of national chain stores on 125th Street. Now, will a Marcus Garvey come out of Harlem again? Would someone like Malcolm X today, if he was on the south side of Chicago, go to Harlem to start his movement? Probably not. The income mix has changed in Harlem. Harlem has changed. And so we got to think about reducing this poverty is probably a positive thing, but a consequence of that is some of the things that made Harlem so historic, and the people, the writers, the artists, the social critics that have made that community famous, we may not see anymore. But we should also remember, though, that that tradition isn't going anywhere. The Apollo is still there. The Schomburg is still there. The historic black institutions are still remaining. So, yes, there'll probably be some more white people that move up to Harlem. But again, the neighborhood is 80% African American. I mean, by most standards, we'd still consider Harlem pretty segregated. So it's still going to remain African American. It's still going to maintain the cultural identity of the past. But as we move forward, it may not, and probably is not, going to be the same community. And that's not for me to say whether that's a good or a bad thing. I mean, that's for the residents of the community. All communities go through a transformation. And, you sort of have to look at that. And, I remember one person who I interviewed in Harlem, I opened up the story with her, and she worked at the local laundromat where I took my clothes every week. And she said to me, the one thing constant in life is change. And she was happy that the neighborhood was redeveloping. She said there was more amenities there. There were new clubs were opening up. But she didn't foresee that. And remember I said I went to Harlem and I went back to Bronzeville. When I came back to Harlem, her business and her laundromat was taken out. Now they have a store that sells $500 designer jeans there. Yeah, in the laundromat, right, where the laundromat used to be. So, things are changing, and the thing is, we know they're going to change, and we sort of just have to. I mean, me as a social scientist, I just assess the change. I try to point out to people how it's changing, but I'm not going to come down and say whether it's a good or a bad thing. That Harlem is sort of changing some of its identity. I mean, it definitely is, but Would we want the symbol of Harlem to be what it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where the crack epidemic in the 80s, the boarded up, vacant, abandoned buildings? I mean, what was the symbol of Harlem then, right? And what will the symbol of Harlem now be for Black America? It's going to be an affluent community, which I think a lot of the new residents and some of the old residents are going to take a tremendous amount of pride in Harlem again, because of what it looks like today and compared to how it looked in the 70s and 80s. So I think I've touched on some of the issues. I probably haven't answered the question fully, but it's a question that shouldn't be answered by me, and it never will be fully answered. So it's just sort of more food for thought.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the floor, and are we going to have microphones go around or just have people speak up? Okay, and it's right behind you, so you're first.
When the question was raised, what do people want, it came to mind that maybe we should look at what we want for our children and grandchildren. And it was interesting when Derek described how he got concerned about the situation in Harlem because of his basketball teammates. I had the good fortune to have my children have the opportunity to attend a economically and racially integrated urban high school and still get into name-recognized universities. I don't see that now being a very common occurrence because I see people either going to elite, i.e. extremely economically segregated high school, or or vice versa, one where their opportunities are truncated because of it, or where their opportunities to meet people different from themselves, and therefore even to find a journalist who can write about what Derek writes about because they've lived with people different from themselves is a challenge for the newspaper or the TV. So anyway, I wonder if you all could address that while you talk about maintaining character of neighborhoods.
Okay, let me just see if there's any immediate question. Derek, are you the last of your kind?
Well, no. Yeah, no, I'm not. But I think, for me, I grew up in, a segregated suburb of New York City. The number of African American families, I think, were 5, maybe a little higher. It wasn't higher than 10. And so the opportunity to come across people of a different racial makeup or different African Americans, came in part that I became very good friends. One of my best friends was one of the African Americans who lived in my community, and that had a major impact on my life. It wasn't just that, though, but it was also through my basketball playing days, where I played in Peekskill, New York, where people think of Westchester County and they think that it's all white and all rich. It's not. There are sort of inner city areas or low-income black areas within Westchester, and I think a lot of players on my team in Somers got to experience other lifestyles, other racial groups by going. We used to go over to Peekskill and play over there, and the Peekskill guys would come over to Somers and we'd play at our park. But I still didn't see the harsh inner city environment, so I went down to Harlem. And I don't know how many individuals would get that experience. But I would say for white residents that may be moving to a place like Harlem or Bronzeville, and even not even white residents, but affluent African American residents, a big problem that we have is people think because these areas are becoming more economically integrated that we will have this mixing and people sort of rubbing off. There'll be this role modeling effect. But what is happening, and I think you pointed this out a little bit with your comment, is that people are choosing to go to private schools. If they can afford to move up to Harlem, they can also afford to send their kids to private schools, and they may not be integrating as much as we might think with other members of that community. But even though that might be the case, I think we should think that even if they're going to separate schools and kids are living in that same community, they might be going to the Harlem Y and coming across. They might be going to local parks. So we have a better chance that there will be sort of integration happening and role modeling when people of different races and different economic statuses live within the same community, as opposed if we just had, totally segregated communities. Even though we have the phenomenon where the people who are moving in are still sort of sheltering their youth by sending them to private school. So.
Okay. Right over here.
I, like Mary, was a Columbia student, and remember when Columbia tried to build a gym down the hill from Morningside Heights. Those were the days. But in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, the Great Society programs were born. And you haven't mentioned in your talk, I don't know if you do in your book, but there was the War on Poverty, and then there was the HUD Model Cities program. And I worked in that Model Cities program when I worked for the City of New York. The effort we had there for Central Harlem and East Harlem was to take the resources that President Johnson was affording us and to create an ideal Harlem. We didn't think about integration. Harlem was going to be forever black. East Harlem was going to be forever Puerto Rican. That never happened, obviously. What's your assessment of the Great Society programs as it affected Harlem?
Well, I didn't write. Let me preface by saying I didn't write much about the Great Society programs in the book, but I know of the Great Society program. I can't say that I've really looked at its impact on Harlem specifically, but from just looking at the general literature, I think that the Great Society programs opened up a lot of opportunities for civic engagement in these areas. The community action programs went in and allowed for residents who didn't have a voice to have a voice in their community. Did it have a large impact in terms of dictating where federal resources were spent, such as where public housing was going to be developed? I couldn't say it had a major impact on that, because we still had most of the public housing being built in segregated black communities. But I think it did provide a training ground for, one of the things, the reason Harlem and Bronzeville is having so many black middle-class professionals move back in is because it started with the 60s. Since 1960, we've had a tripling of the black middle class. So the black middle class now has an aggregate income and buying power that they can buy into Harlem. They can buy in anywhere they want to go, actually. But they're choosing to go back to historic black communities. So I think that those programs did have an impact in terms of bringing up a set of leadership. But in terms of structuring the way neighborhoods look like, it didn't have an impact on that. That's my assessment.
This question reminded me of some thoughts I have had in reading this book and also thinking about some of the revitalization that's happening here in D.C. I think the layers of impact that Derek describes in this book is really important and helpful. But he acknowledges that the changes occurring in Bronzeville and Harlem didn't sort of start with the policies of the 1990s. In a lot of these communities, people had been trying to ignite redevelopment for some time, often for decades. And it felt like, you keep lighting a match and nothing's happening, and so you light another and nothing's happening. It felt like all that effort was for naught for a long time, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. In the District of Columbia, Jim Gibson talks about in the early 70s planning the metro routes and really focusing on making sure that the design of Washington's metro reinforced the centrality of the District of Columbia. Well, now, decades later, when other global forces have changed and the fortunes of the city have changed in a lot of other respects, those investments made decades ago and which seemingly were having no effect at that time, wow, the shape of the metro in the District of Columbia is a part of the story about the way redevelopment is happening. So I think I mean, this book has done a terrific job of looking at the different layers, but we also need to look back and see the ways in which previous generations of policy partly contributed to the problem, but also, in some cases, we're putting building blocks in place for the revitalization that's happening now. Really complex story.
Yeah, one other thing related is that, the community action agencies that came out of the Great Society programs, they were the grounding and the foundation for the community boards that are in New York. And Keith talked a little bit about this, but the community boards are where residents sort of battle it out with developers. If developers are getting resources from the city, such as getting the vacant lots that Keith talked about, they have to go before this board. It's politically appointed. It's about 40 residents, and say, this is what we're planning on doing with this lot. And the residents have an opportunity to sort of give a thumbs up, a thumbs down. Now, it's an advisory panel, and the city council has the ultimate decision. But, again, the civic engagement, because one thing I argue in the book is that civic engagement is related to why the public housing buildings remain in Harlem. It wasn't just that the city decided, in New York we should maintain the public housing. It was that in New York, because of the political structure, people are much more civically engaged. And if you sort of trace over time the politics of public housing, you'll see that the public housing residents, dating back to the 40s, were very, very civically engaged and put pressures on politicians like Keith to say, we vote for you, and if we didn't vote for you, you wouldn't get elected. So you are going to maintain the building I live in. Now in Chicago, if you sort of said the same thing, they had the community action agencies. Mayor Daley, the senior father, controlled them. And today there's nothing that's comparable to the community boards that it's in New York City in Chicago. And so part of the reason the public housing looks the way it does is that residents there didn't have the opportunity to get politically engaged. If they said to Mayor Daley Sr., we're not going to vote for you, he would just say, yeah, okay, I'm going to cut your welfare benefits, I'm going to cut you out of public housing, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so the political structure, when you asked what was the impact of the community action agencies, well, it varies city by city because of the political structure allows for certain things to happen in some cities where it may not be allowed to happen in others. So we always need to think about that local context.
Okay, why don't we go here first, and then we'll come over there. We have time for a few more questions, and then we'll go in the back. So you're next.
So Derek and I we're grad students together at the University of Chicago.
We have a microphone for you.
Oh, cool. Super. So I have a handful of questions, but I'll try to make them very quick and sweet. First, it was the dichotomy of maintaining diversity versus job boost through commercial growth, which was brought up by Dr. Pattillo. One of my questions is must it be a dichotomy, right? We're comparing Harlem and Bronzeville, and we see, various patterns and different outcomes, right? Can we still maintain the diversity while simultaneously, increasing social services and simultaneously encouraging commercial growth, but, maybe to businesses that are more indigenous to the neighborhood? Second question is growth of central cities and kind of revitalization. I'm very interested in terms of how gas prices and certain market swings are going to affect the direction that urban neighborhoods go in. But also, I'm interested in terms of economic downturn. The Dow is down about 130 points right now, give or take. I keep checking my BlackBerry. And so part of me is a little concerned. I was talking to one of my friends, she works for the state of California yesterday, and we were talking about, and that's my home state, I love it. There's an issue of the fact that they're suffering now they're facing a deficit of roughly $20 billion. Even in terms of when we're thinking about the kind of policies that we want to implement and the kind of changes that should be made, we're looking at municipalities and state governments that really can't do it, and a federal government that's just running up a debt out at the wazoo. And then finally, kind of on the more academic tip, in my political science classes, I make my kids read a lot of sociology, especially Oliver and Shapiro, black wealth, white wealth, and kind of understanding issues in terms of the accumulation of wealth and assets and the differentiation between what has happened historically with the African American community versus what has happened for whites, whether immigrant societies or other. And what I'm concerned is that in terms of Harlem in particular, where we're talking about these increases of wealth in the city and this kind of influx of cash combined with a greater sense of affluence, are those increases benefiting, how to put this, are the original residents of the Harlem communities, are they actually getting some sort of accumulation of wealth for themselves? Or is it more that wealthy white people are moving in? And what does that mean in terms of, like, I want, the black community of Harlem to gain wealth, to gain assets. And what does it mean just that money's coming in, but are the original residents really benefiting? So you guys have thank you so much for your comments.
I don't think so, but I mean, there's a theory that the rising tide raises all boats. Someone could ascribe to that theory, but I don't think that it's happening. What's happening is that, and I was talking about in terms of preserving the character of a community. You have these young, wealthier folks, some black, some white, whatever. They're coming up now. But in terms of preserving the character of a community, these younger folks that are coming up, they really have no sense of the history of the community in which they're moving into. They may have read the brochures, they may have seen the stuff online, and the wonderful descriptions that you were giving before, I guess, on the Loop or whatever you were talking about. But they have no idea that maybe where they're moving into was where Marcus Garvey gave his first speech. They have no idea that Adam Powell was leading work stoppages in front of the old Woolworths. They have no idea who I am.
All right, come on.
Well, I'm just saying. And I'm not saying in terms of ego, but I'm saying it in terms of being the elected representative of the community in which they've decided to invest. They have no clue. I mean, and certainly, my family has a long, rich history. I mean, my father is probably the most famous judge, arguably, aside from Thurgood Marshall. They call him Turn 'em Loose Bruce. He's written many books. Poet, intellectual, blah, blah, blah. But they have no idea who he is or was. But they just don't care. And when Mignon in the book was talking about what did she call them? Implants. Implants. In order to preserve the character of the neighborhood, you have to know the history of where you're moving into. So to answer your question, I don't see any real benefit yet to the indigenous community, to the new folks that are coming in. I just don't see it. Maybe you might get a little construction job here and there from the folks, but I don't really see a lasting impact right now.
Let me take a different stance on that. Whereas Percy Sutton's done pretty well. We got Booker. We've got some developers who have done well. There are Webb and Booker and the groups, right? So there are people who have lived in Harlem for most of their lives that have had real estate businesses in Harlem, that with this development, now, I guess the question you ask, is the majority of residents benefiting? No. Is there a set of elite black individuals who are making millions of dollars off the redevelopment that is occurring? Yes.
Is the crime rate down for the people who lived there before and are living there now?
I don't know the crime rates.
Some would say yes, some would say no.
Yeah.
I mean, the drugs are still going on, and some would say that they've been pushed. I mean, I'll give you an example. There was a block that I knew that I could never walk down when I was a kid. 140th Street between 7th Avenue. That was a rough block. That was rough. And my man in the back, he's nodding his head. He knows that block. Anyway, but right now, the block is lovely. But you still have some of the folks, are thugs in the street. They wear the pants down by the knees, and the hoods come up. But now when white folks walk by, when I was a kid, when I walked by, I'd probably get beaten up. Or at least somebody trying to go through my pockets. White folks walk by, they move out of the way and let them walk by. So there may be some sort of plantation syndrome. Thugs going on.
haven't answered all the questions, but I know of at least four or five people, so I'm going to take two people at once. This gentleman here and the gentleman over there will come up here, and then we'll get the next two. So right there is one microphone, and the gentleman over here is the other. Go ahead. You go ahead over here first. Well, go ahead.
First off, I just want to say I echo Assemblyman Wright's comments that the discussion has been great, and I'm pretty proud. I went to college with Derek, so I'm excited to see him doing so well. I never knew he was this smart, so this is impressive. But I had a question, and Assemblyman Wright basically laid out a turning point in time politically in New York, where he discussed a shift from the Dinkins administration to Giuliani's administration, and the hold and the power play that happened with the fact that the mayor's office controlled 80% of the land in Harlem. And I think what I've heard throughout these currents is a lot of the tension that the moderator brought up about, eliminating poverty, one, or maintaining the character and integrity of a community that has a rich and historic tradition. And I wonder, what would a David Dinkins administration have meant for the redevelopment of Harlem, and how would it have been different? And what does that say about poverty and urban development, or does it say more about identity politics and what African Americans are trying to sort out? We talked about the op-ed with the Jesse Jackson issue, and it's certainly been in play. Last year there was Barack Obama, is he black enough? This year, Reverend Wright, he's too black, and all of those things. So I wonder if you all could speak to that.
Okay, and let's get the other question on the board. We'll come back to you after.
Derek, I will read your book, definitely. But when I think of urban renewal, I'm thinking of a large segment of our American population that we have to address in this country. And I want to ask the panel something about this. Housing is just, to me, the motor in the car. We have to look at what's going to drive the car, the wheels. We got to look at the schools, the tax base, the crime, why it occurs. And when we talk about what do we want, we have to also look at what do we expect. And do we want to have the urban areas, as we know, culturally identifiable? Because when you look at Harlem, Bronzeville, which I'm also familiar with, you look at the cultural aspect, and that is the 3 R's, which it's traditionally been. 3 R's in those areas have been rent, rats, and roaches. Do we want to continue that area? Thank you.
Okay, why don't we try to get all the panelists in? So we have been hearing a lot about Chicago. Maybe we'll start with you.
I'm a little speechless on the rent, rats, and roaches, because following on the discussion that's their cultural identity, I would hope not. I would think of another R, Richard Wright in Bronzeville, maybe. What other R's could I come? I'm sure I'd come up with a lot of other R's. So maybe that was meant to be provocative, so I won't spend too much time on that one. But so I think your broader point about wheels, steering wheels, and the motor, and so on. And they are all going very much hand in hand. So I think Derek's book very much focuses on, it's not actually about housing, it's more kind of about the politics of the debates around these things. But there are many, he mentions, for example, Arlene Davila's work on Spanish Harlem, and she has a wonderful chapter about schools. And I think what's great about this literature that's coming out, that again Derek cites, is I think we have different emphases and different way. You and I just had a little debate about the black folk who are moving in more, on the allies of the white power structure, or are they more the voices of the disadvantaged in the neighborhood? So we have somewhat different approaches, but all of us pretty much, I think, agree on are talking about some of the same things. So Arlene Davila talks about some of the new schools coming into East Harlem, and the same kind of Puerto Rican middlemen who are sometimes the spokespeople of these what I call school management organizations in a number of our cities. We're having charter schools and so on. And I also talk about schools in my book because all of the people who are driving these transformations know that if you want to keep the people who are buying these $1 million condos, if you want to keep them once they have kids, then you have to work on the schools as well. And I think the debates around school policy are exactly the same debate. So we have now, and I use Audre Lorde's quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," to levy my own critique of things like charter schools, which make some progress, but then we see what the difficulties are right behind that progress. I myself am on the board of a charter school. I'm using the master's tools because that's what's available to try as a black person who wants to be a voice for disadvantaged folks to make a difference. But I also am doing research that interviews parents who have kids going to the local public school and parents who have kids going to our charter school. And you ask them things like, I ask the parents of the people going to the local public school, which is very bad in terms of its test scores and graduation rates. And I say, so how did you choose this school for your kids? Because choice is, of course, the buzzword in schools. How did you choose this school for your kids? I ain't choose this school. They put me in this school. So all of our great policies about choice and charters and so on go right out the window when people, this idea of choice is crazy. And the people who are choosing are the people who could choose all kinds of good things anyway. So, so that's one. So I think on all of these things that you mentioned, on schools, on business investment and so on, they're just really difficult, complicated trade-offs that we're making. The young men who get to go to my charter school get a great education, and I'm happy to be able to be a part of that. But at the same time, everybody can't get in, and all of the parents aren't being able to choose the best school. So,
it's a possible question. It really can't be answered. What would have happened had Dinkins won a second term? But do you want to use that as a framework to speculate on what alternatives there may have been, alternative futures there may have been?
I think, and to answer quickly,
I think one thing I'd add, just
very quickly, because we are running out of time.
The point of the question is not necessarily David Dinkins. It's if you have an African American at the helm making those real estate decisions, does Harlem's character get protected more or less, and how does that affect urban planning? When we talk about eliminating poverty rates.
Okay, very quickly, because we are.
I think very quickly. I mean, just because I know the man and worked for him for a while, I think that he probably would have been more sensitive in terms of indigenous folks who suffered through the bad times, if you will, that they should be benefiting through the good times. I think he would have been more cognizant about the local business folks being able to benefit from this redevelopment, whereas with the Giuliani administration, I think it was just very sterile, very cut and dry.
Okay, final two questions. This gentleman there, and then we'll come up here.
Hi, my name is Todd Wiggins. I live here in the district, and I have a question. I'm very interested in the topic of urban renewal, which is obviously why I'm here. But I'm also curious as to whether Derek or anyone in the panel, or perhaps anyone in the room, has thought about putting together documentaries to talk about these concepts and to show Harlem or to show Southeast DC or to show various areas throughout the country that are being revitalized, and how we can get that, perhaps even put it on a channel or create a YouTube or something like that where people can respond with their own ideas in constructive ways about how they can benefit their communities, because I think it's time that could be done, and technology allows us to do it. And that's what I'm working on now myself. So if anyone in this room would be interested in working with me to create documentaries that would reflect what you're trying to do with your book, because some people just don't read. I mean, I have stacks of books in my room that I can't read everything that I have. But what I'm saying is a lot of people are very interested in computer videos now, and we've seen it, especially younger audiences that might be interested in learning some of these things through more visual techniques.
And final question or comment right here.
My name is Leanne Chavez, and I go to school at Columbia University, so I've seen like the whole thing with Manhattanville going on, and I don't know much about what their plans are exactly, but I wanted to know how much has policy been reflecting the racial integration problem that we've had. How much has it been reflecting that issue? I don't know. I know there are some Apollo has been stayed there, and other museums in Harlem that keep the cultural just keep it alive there. But what other things could be implemented, and what have they been doing to keep that?
I think actually these two questions come together in an interesting way, which is taking this discussion and looking forward, and how might local policies be different in a way that would perhaps build on the advances you're talking about, but also preserve community and community character. And in thinking about how to answer that, how do new technologies make a difference as well? And maybe we'll take one final round, and if anybody can answer those questions, that would be great, or any other final observation. And maybe we'll give Derek the last word. So.
There are a couple of documentaries that I would recommend. One, Sudhir Venkatesh has a documentary on the transformation of public housing in Chicago. It's a much narrower focus than what Derek's doing, but it's quite powerful. It's called Dislocation. John Jackson has a documentary, I'm not quite sure if it's out yet, but is doing a documentary on Harlem, and he has a book called Harlem World. Again, a different kind of focus from Derek's, but the documentary, I think, will be complementary. I was going to say one more, but I forgot. But with my last word, I just want to, again, amplify something that Derek said in his final remarks, which is about the importance of preserving public housing, hard unit public housing. And I thought that was a really excellent policy proposal in your ending about needing to pay attention to the operating funds. Because in Chicago, which is, of course, the polar opposite of New York, where we're demolishing everything and building everything as mixed income, the enticement is even to demolish things that aren't severely distressed, or that to mess around with this with the viability tests. One year they seem to be passing the viability test. Lo and behold, next year they're not. Now we can knock it down, and the sweetness of the mixed income to free up land that is now really, really attractive in order for public housing authorities to get money in their coffers to maintain their other units because their operating funds are so depleted. I think is really, really scary, especially for, as you mentioned, the viable public housing that really exists. So I just wanted to end with reiterating your point.
So I guess I would just close by saying that this has been a wonderful opportunity to talk about these issues and how difficult they are. Mm-hmm. They cross lines of class and race that we're uncomfortable talking about. They push on the issue of what does it mean to preserve the positives of a community, a black community or a Latino community that was constrained to a neighborhood by forces of segregation and exclusion and created a community there. So what does it mean to say it would be better if we could share communities with one another, but that shouldn't mean that you have to give up the identity that's been created out of exclusion and hardship. And I mean, this is a poignant discussion in New Orleans right now as well. And these are really tough conversations. My closing view is that we don't have them enough. We're afraid to have them. And that we're not going to muddle these kinds of policies forward in a positive direction unless we're sort of willing to take the risk of having the conversation.
I agree. No, and I know it's kind of funny, but I do absolutely agree. I don't need to say anymore.
Your final word.
Well, I'll say one thing to get to your point about preserving and preserving some of the culture. And I think one of the things that I haven't seen Chicago or New York City do is put together some policies that integrate the indigenous businesses, the small mom and pops that have been the character or have been related to the character of these communities. And with the development that's happening on 125th Street, they're really not doing much to enable some of the smaller businesses to stay. And I think that's something New York should focus on. And I also think it's something that Chicago should focus on as well. When I talked a little bit about the Hope 6 initiatives, a lot of the Hope 6s have commercial real estate on the first level of these new mixed income developments. Why couldn't we place some of the small mom and pops in those places? I mean, the one on State Street and Stateway Gardens has the Starbucks there, and everyone thinks it's great that the Starbucks came where public housing once was. But couldn't we have put a different type of coffee shop there? I think that might preserve some of the character of the community a little bit more. And just one other point with public policy in the Hope 6s is Marjorie talked about just doing some integration training, and it doesn't have to be racial integration. There's economic integration, and so. I think that what in these Hope 6 sites, what we need to do is there has to be money actually given to get high-income residents who are paying $500,000 for these townhomes who are living right next to somebody who's a public housing tenant and living close to an equivalent unit. There seems to be a lot of animosity in those developments when that occurs, but there needs to be funding put in place. I mean, is it getting their kids together to play basketball or to do anything, tennis? It doesn't even have to be sports, but there has to be some kind of tool and some kind of thing to sort of push people to integrate and so that they will say hello to each other, when they walk out of their door. So I think that's something that's important that needs to be implemented. That is, there's no resources going to that. Any resources that are being spent on this is coming from private foundations, and that's a drop in the bucket. And I just want to close by, I started by thanking my panelists, but I think I really need to thank them, Mary, Marjorie, and Keith, Blair, for moderating, putting this all together, for all of you for being a part of this. This has just been a blessed day, and I want to thank you all for being here. Thanks.
Thank you.